Hello and welcome to KingstonCitizens.org's Roundtable, What's the Process?, where we record a show each week and broadcast them weekly. We are here to tackle local City of Kingston and Ulster County topics with a range of guests. Tonight, I'm with my co-host Jennifer Schwartz Berky. I'll let her introduce herself in a moment. My name is Rebecca Martin, and I am the director and co-founder of KingstonCitizens.org.
And I'm Jennifer Schwartz Berky. I am a co-founder and advisor to KingstonCitizens.org and an urban planner by profession. And I also served one term as a county legislator in Ulster.
Great.
Glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. These are wonderful opportunities for us. To learn more about KingstonCitizens.org, you can visit our website at www.kingstoncitizens.org. And next week, we're having a topic that's I'm excited to talk about because I think it's super important, and I'm not sure if everybody understands in the community. So this will be a first step in trying to understand comprehensive plan rezoning. Jenny knows all about this. And the title of the program is, What Does Form-Based Code Mean for Kingston? And we're going to have a community member on, Tanya Garment, who has been following zoning in Kingston and land use for many years. So we're looking forward to getting into that and having Tanya with us. But tonight, we're going to be talking about pharmaceuticals and other unregulated contaminants in the Hudson and Rondout Creek, the Hudson River and the Rondout Creek. And I'm so happy to be able to introduce Dan Shapley, who's the director of the water quality program at Riverkeeper, and who I have the privilege to work with every day of the week, 5 days a week. I'm at Riverkeeper, and I work in as part of Dan's program as his team, one member of a 4-member team. And I learned so much every day working with Dan. So Dan, thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you for having me, Rebecca. It's my privilege to work with you.
Thanks. So I want to just read a short bio, Dan, to give the listeners and viewers an opportunity to know who you are. So as director of Riverkeeper's water quality program, Dan Shapley and the water quality team coordinate the largest community science water quality sampling project of its kind, sampling hundreds of locations throughout the Hudson River and its tributaries. So that's a 13,000 square mile mission area, right, Dan? Primarily to show when and where water is safe for swimming. The data gathered is the basis for advocacy to stop water pollution by catalyzing needed investments in water infrastructure and watershed management, including protection of drinking water at its source. A lifelong Hudson Valley resident, Dan Shapley joined Riverkeeper in October of 2011. He was a founding board member of the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance and served from 2015 to 2019. He is also a board member since 2018 of the Hudson River Watershed Alliance and serves on the Joint Environmental Committee for the village and town of Rhinebeck. Dan is a graduate of Hartwick College, where he started his career as a journalist, and Dan is also a poet. So Dan, thank you. And you're here tonight because last month, in the month of May, at a recent Hudson 7 meeting, so the Hudson 7 is an intermunicipal council. That intermunicipal, Dan, tell me the exact name of this so I get this right. The Hudson 7 is an
the Hudson River Drinking Water Intermunicipal Council.
Thank you. And the group came together 2 years ago, right? How did they come together? Why don't you give us a little bit of background and why they came together?
Sure. Yeah, it's such a wonderful group of people to work with, and for such an essential cause. It's really one of the great pleasures of our work, I think. I know you would feel the same, to be able to work with the Hudson 7. But they came together. It started with a conversation I was having with Gary Bassett, who's the mayor of the village of Rhinebeck, and really just thinking that we needed to, tell our neighbors that we shared this Hudson River not only as a beautiful thing to look at, or maybe a place to go and fish or swim or kayak, but we also, many of us, shared as our drinking water source. And before we brought those communities together, which is the city and town of Poughkeepsie, the village and town of Rhinebeck, and the towns of Esopus, Hyde Park, and Lloyd, all, the people in those towns and villages and cities drink their water comes, from the Hudson and is treated and then distributed to their homes. So before we started, a lot of communities, the people in one community might not have even known that was their source of drinking water. And they almost certainly didn't know that their neighbor to the north or south or east or west was also their source. So it was bringing them together was a great moment to just kind of put a fact in the world that had been there but unappreciated, and it's really been transformative, just that fact. But it really started with a conversation with Gary to sort of get everyone together and start to see how we could they could compare notes about how they were treating the water and what they could learn from one another, and how we could come together to protect the Hudson River as a drinking water source.
Yeah, it's been an incredible project to witness, and they've been meeting every month for the last few years. Town supervisors, mayors, water operators. And so in May, during their regular meeting, and I'm going to pull this up. Dan, do you mind using your phone? You did, thank you. During the meeting, a study was brought forward by one of the Hudson 7's technical advisors in engineering, Paul Melrose. He brought up the following report, and I just want to show. It's a report from 2018. Do you both see that? So this is actually an article on Earth Institute, which is a platform of Columbia University, State of the Planet, where they told the story of the report shortly after it was released in 2018. And in the report, and we can pull that up too, and all of the resources we have here, we're going to show, we'll attach to the show's video so the public can see them. In the report, it talks about there being a study to find pharmaceuticals in the Hudson, the first study of its kind. It looked at a variety of chemicals, right? And 16 different pharmaceutical compounds, rather, including antibiotics, drugs for treating high blood pressure, high cholesterol, epilepsy, ulcers, heartburn, common aspirin substitutes, such as, how do you pronounce that? Acetopin, I can never. You're on mute, Jenny.
Acetaminophen.
Thank you. So the medications are believed to enter the river through sewage outfalls. And in Kingston, Dan, do we have one or two in the Rondout Creek? We know there's Hasbrook.
Well, Kingston has a treatment plant that treats all the wastewater, all the sewage from all the homes and businesses and discharges that treated water to the Rondout Creek every day, ongoing. And then on particularly rainy days, there are, I think, 3 points that within the collections, within the pipes that bring the sewage from homes to the plant that are designed to overflow as they collect water from the street as well as the sewage. And that's common to many older communities. In Kingston, really, it's that one overflow point called the Hasbrook overflow. It's right, right in the Rondout section of the city. That's where almost all of that overflow occurs. The others are very, very rarely discharged.
The Hasbrook overflow is located where, if you were looking at it from the river, Dan?
You want me to implicate my friends? Well, it's right under the Hudson River Maritime Museum, frankly. So if you're on the river looking at the museum, or if you're walking along the walkway, that's, you know, that lovely walkway, or at the docks, it's right in that vicinity.
Okay.
It's also really important.
They didn't choose that, you know. That's
no, but I think it's right. I mean, it's the start of the context here, and it's not. We're not trying to blame anybody. We're trying to help people to understand and to help, really. To, if you know that it's there, you can. I mean, we should be paying attention to it, in my opinion.
Well, also, it's really important to know that that particular CSO, that outfall, what it collects from is probably 2/3 of the overflow in Kingston, because if you think about the Rondout and the hills that are coming down into the Rondout, there's a lot of runoff coming from that sort of valley, so to speak. So it's the majority of the overflow in Kingston as a result. Just think about that sort of whole hill. It's got like its own watershed.
Well, yeah, and maybe for those who don't know what a CSO, Dan, I don't know if this is the best visual, but because it's, I mean, this is something I wanted to talk about too. This is directly from the Department of Environmental Conservation site. Why don't we explain what that is actually? Again, just for context. So is this a good image to help to explain what Kingston's Hasbrook CSO looks like and works, how it works?
Yeah, I mean, if you try and make a little sense of this image, what you see is that, you know, the pipe going off to the left of the image is what is carrying all of our sewage on a normal day. And that's what we want it to do. We want the sewage in the pipe going to the treatment plant and getting treated. And then the big overflow, that big arrow in the front, is this, you know, point in the system that's designed to, you know, spill over right into the Rondout Creek in this case. And that happens because that same pipe fills up with stormwater that's flowing down the storm drains that are on all the streets that you see, well, many of the streets that you see around the city. And like I said, this is not unique to Kingston. Every old city in the Northeast, particularly, is like this, is built on a system like this. Not everyone, but many of them. In the Hudson River, you know, everything, the Capital District has about 90 of these overflow points that discharge into the Hudson River. Kingston has, as we just said, basically one, and a couple others that hardly ever overflow. So it's not huge on the scale of communities, even on the Hudson, that are dealing with this issue. But it is, I mean, we're probably getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but it's among the more, Kingston's been the most proactive probably of any community in trying to stop these overflows. It is not under any DEC order to do more than it already had as of a couple of years ago. And yet it is continuing to seek and get grants to separate those sewers so that either the pipe carries only sewage and only stormwater, or do green infrastructure so that the stormwater doesn't all flow into the drain, but is allowed to kind of absorb into the ground and seep in, so it doesn't cause such a flush into the system. And through those two techniques and others, reduce and hopefully, ultimately eliminate the overflow. And the Clean Water Act really only requires communities to reduce but not eliminate their overflows. And Kingston has kind of met the Clean Water Act requirement that as the state has implemented it, and it's trying to do more. So the city really deserves a lot of credit for that. And I think it's, in my mind, there's a direct line from, the mayor having been an educator kayaking on the creek and serving on the, Hudson River Estuary Management Advisory Council, and then becoming mayor and maintaining a focus on this. So I think it's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing and something that, we'd love to see every community take that much ownership of and put such a priority on.
Dan, how many CSOs, combined sewer overflows, are there in the Hudson River from New York City to Troy or to Albany or wherever, to the Mohawk?
If you count all of them in New York City, which is 460 or so around New York City, I think it's around 600,
right,
roughly, if I remember right. So it's, so if you think about that, it was, let's say 450 for easy math in New York City, almost 100 in the Capital District. That's 550 already, and then the rest are sort of sprinkled around from Utica, Little Falls, Amsterdam on the Mohawk River, Glens Falls and Hudson Falls on the Upper Hudson. And then as you get down into our kind of region here in the Mid-Hudson, City of Hudson, Village of Catskill, Kingston, Poughkeepsie, Newburgh, West Point has one, and Yonkers. I think I may have missed one, but so not all of those cities. Peekskill, for instance, doesn't. It has all separate sewers, but many of the other older cities and villages have some amount of these combined systems.
Right, and I wanted to point that out just so that the public understood that there's a lot of them. And so can you just very, very briefly explain why there's a lot of them?
Well, I mean, the kind of short answer I usually give is that, when these systems were put in place, imagine 150 years ago, the problem was that people were getting cholera from sewage being, next door. And so the best public health, initiative at that time was just like, let's get this away from us and out into that creek. And that was a positive, from a public health perspective at that time. And then as the, the system, as we paved over the streets and everything, those combined sort of uses of those same conduits, the pipes, in some cases, we're talking about wooden pipes, clay pipes, really old stuff that are underground in some cases. We got to another phase of our, appreciation for the environment, our concern about other public health risks that flow from dumping all that sewage untreated. And that was, the 1970s. We're talking not that long ago in history that we started to say, well, let's treat that waste before it goes into the river, at all. And then, following that treatment, then this kind of, we're, implementing this yet, greater protection in saying, hey, that stuff that overflows in rain, maybe we shouldn't allow all that either, because it also has a negative effect. So it's been a kind of ratcheting up of public health protections over time and environmental protections over time.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny, for pulling out that image. I'm just going to bring us back to the report. And Jenny, I'm moving through this so we kind of understand where we're at with this report. And Dan, thanks for that summary. I think that's very helpful for people to understand. So I'm going to pull this back up, which is the report, which is an article regarding the report, which we can bring up too. So, I have been with you since 2017, and as we were saying, I don't necessarily recall this study, but it was brought out at a meeting with the Hudson 7 in May. And what struck me was that there was a high level of pharmaceuticals that were detected in the city of Kingston's outfall. So the Hasbrook outfall, right? That perhaps
no, from the treatment plant. That would be not the overflow point at Hasbrook, but the treatment plant, which is just downstream.
So perhaps the worst was at the sewage outfall for the city of Kingston, some 90 miles upriver from New York City. Here, at least 5 compounds showed up in potentially worrisome quantities. High levels were also found further upriver near Troy and Albany. So it was certainly not my intention. We shared this on KingstonCitizens.org, not to scare people, but to say, hey, listen, if you're flushing drugs down the toilet or dumping drugs down the drain, you should really stop. And that, this is the first step. The second step is, well, what do you do with them? So that was it. And that was the intention, to pull this forward. And it's brought up a lot of questions from the public. And so we wanted to have a conversation with you. And one of the things you said to me was, this is more of a nuanced problem. So let me get into the nuances. And so here we are today. So with that said, Jenny, I don't know if you have anything to include, because what I'd like to do is get into the report that Riverkeeper and Columbia University created on this issue. Maybe we can start from there and get into, right, why Kingston was noted as it was in the article. Jenny, anything to add?
No, go ahead. I'll ask as we go along if I have questions.
Okay. So thanks for that setup. And I think the first thing I would say is that we worked with 2 research groups right around the same time, and there were 2 papers published in 2018. So the one that you've been talking about so far is actually one that was led by the EPA. It was supported by Riverkeeper as well as Columbia, and Columbia wrote up that great blog post. But it's an EPA study, and here you can see it here. Mark Cantwell was the lead author, and he's a researcher out in Rhode Island who'd done a lot of, he called Riverkeeper out of the blue one day and got transferred over to me and said, do you do any sampling in the Hudson River? I said, well, yeah, we do some of that, because we've been since 2008 working with Columbia and Queens College, sampling 74 locations in the Hudson every month, and Captain John Lipson's out doing that, and so it was great. So I was able to say, yeah, we do that. And so he said, great, we want to work with you because we've been studying other estuaries and we want to get data from the Hudson, which is, which they didn't have any information about at that time. So the basis for the study and really his research group, interestingly, is part of a long process that under the Clean Water Act, before you get to first of all, the Clean Water Act doesn't say we can't pollute. It just says you can't pollute without a permit, and the permit tells you how much concentration you're allowed to discharge of any regulated contaminant. For a new thing to be regulated, there has to be a bunch of studies to find out, does it affect human health or does it affect aquatic life? And if so, at what level is it risky? And so his research is really, contributing to an eventual understanding of if there is enough pharmaceuticals in our water to affect aquatic life. That's sort of the ultimate question, and this study is like a little tiny piece of. So we worked with EPA to do that study. We also worked with Cornell University on a separate study that I'll talk about, and was similar in that it was looking for pharmaceuticals, but it was also looking for pesticides. It was looking for some industrial compounds. It was looking for like over 200 different chemical compounds that could be detected at tiny concentrations. So in all of this, we're talking about things that aren't regulated. in water. We don't have a limit on them. We can't say that this amount is unsafe and that amount would be safe. There's no regulation of these yet. And if you look at, another research group in our region, that's a wonderful group of scientists at the Carey Institute in Millbrook. One of those scientists, Emma Rossi Marshall, does a lot of research on pharmaceuticals, and she's been part of some research that's in papers and thinking that is pointed out that just since the 1970s, the number of chemicals and the volume of chemicals, whether they're just if you're old enough to imagine, we didn't have commercials for pharmaceuticals until a few years ago, right? I mean, now they're everywhere because there's so many more pharmaceuticals that are on the market that we're using. So there's just like a explosion in the volume and the number of these things that are out there that we use, and many of them we need for our health, and hopefully most of the ones we're using we need.
Dan, I'd once heard there's something like I'd once heard something like there's 8,000 chemicals that we've created that are in the environment, that have been introduced into the environment, and we test for 300 of them or something like that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it's 80,000, not 8,000.
80,000.
There's something like, yeah, and I think there was another revision of that.
300
it might be a lot more like 40,000 or something, but it's still a huge number of chemicals that have been introduced into commerce one way or another. And the Safe Drinking Water Act has about 100 regulated contaminants that a drinking water system will look for on any given test, as part of its requirements. So there's a lot that's potentially out there, probably at tiny levels that we never usually look for. So everything we're talking about today are sort of in that universe of the things that are out there because we've used them in products or used them in pharmaceuticals or used them in industry, but they're not regulated. And part of the research, particularly with the EPA, was to start to gather enough information to understand where there could be or should be some regulations. But that's some,
And here is my answer, right? It's 84,000.
84,000.
Organic chemicals are registered for use within the United States. So is that number accurate, that we're only testing for 300? Is that somewhere that's known? I think that's significant.
Yeah, the Safe Drinking Water Act requires about, it's roughly 100. And then, we've been talking in the region and in the country a lot about PFOA, PFOS. These are the chemicals affecting the drinking water supply in Newburgh, which caused the city to switch to another supply.
What are the acronyms? Do you recall? I mean, it's the end of the day. I had trouble remembering the Hudson Seven's name, which is terrible because it's a part of my heart there. But it's the end of the day. So what does the acronym stand for, Dan? And where does it originate?
PFOA? Or those? Oh, gosh.
PFOA, perfluorous.
All right. Yeah, you're putting me on the spot. I used to be able to recite these things, and I just have let my brain go on them.
Right.
But the family, so just among that family of chemicals, and let me finish just the thought that I was going for, and then I'll come back to that. Those two chemicals are being regulated in drinking water in New York State now because the federal government is not setting standards for them, even though we know they're harmful at very small levels and we don't want them in drinking water. The federal government has not set a new regulation for drinking water in decades. So this is not only are there only 100 chemicals that we look for as part of the Safe Drinking Water Act, but the machinery of setting a new regulation is extremely slow. And so it's just worth remembering sort of the context there. So PFOA and PFOS are part of a family of chemicals that are called per and polyalkyl fluoroalkyl substances, I think. Anyway, and there's, uh-oh, I'm all alone. Oh no, you're still here. Are you still here?
I'm still here.
I'm still here,
Okay.
sorry. I was
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Fluorooctanoic.
and we were featuring you, so don't mind. We've got you covered.
Okay.
All right, so keep going.
So,
PFOA,
anyway,
PFOS.
so just, yeah, the point with that is just to say that, you know, pesticide are, you know, there are a couple pesticides that are regulated. There aren't any pharmaceuticals, I think, that are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. PFOA, PFOS have only just, you know, are on the cusp of becoming regulated in New York State and a couple other states. But we don't add regulations to protect public health from exposure to these in drinking water very quickly. It takes a long time. And we don't often know the risks. We know the risks of those two chemicals because of an amazing, you know, go and watch the movie with Mark Ruffalo.
Deep water.
That's out. Yeah.
Right, which is all about.
And, you know, it tells the story of this, you know, amazing legal effort that resulted in these, you know, some of the best health studies that have ever been done to try and understand what exposure to a chemical can do. And that's why we know a lot about those two chemicals. We know next to nothing about most everything else. When it comes to pharmaceuticals, one thing we do know is that these are chemicals that are designed to have an effect on our body, right? That's why we take them. We take a pharmaceutical because it changes something in your body to produce an effect, a good effect when you're taking it. But what does that do when it's in the water? Those same compounds remain active for the most part out into the water. So whether it's fish or other aquatic life, or potentially the mix of pharmaceuticals that then and you know go into a drinking water system, what effect is exposure to maybe many pharmaceuticals at tiny concentrations? Does it have an effect or not? Those are unknown questions. There are no answers to those questions.
So to the question of those communities that are drawing their drinking water from the river, how is it possible to detect and filter out what they're taking in?
Yeah, Poughkeepsie has done some testing for a small number of these chemicals and found that its treatment process removes them quite well. It does use a different process than the other treatment plants on the river, and I'm not aware of any tests that have been done at the others. And the Hudson is, you know, unique in some ways because it's the Hudson River, but it's also not unique in that these chemicals are widespread. So there are many other drinking water supplies that would be, you know, potentially have some of these. And there's, in fact, been, I think it's referenced in the same article that you shared before and brought us together today. But there's a study, I think the federal government did, that looked at a lot of drinking water supplies and not surprisingly could find, you know, trace amounts of these chemicals, pharmaceuticals in many, if not all of them.
Dan, there's 5 drinking water processing facilities in the Hudson 7. There's 7 communities, but there's 5 water plants, drinking water plants, right? So they are, you cited the Poughkeepsie water treatment facility out of the 5. Because
That's the largest.
It's the largest, and it treats water for the town and the city of Poughkeepsie. There's the water treatment plant in the town of Lloyd. There's the one in the town of Esopus. There's one in the village of Rhinebeck that services the village and the town of Rhinebeck. And then there's Hyde Park, who works with the authority, the Dutchess County Water and Wastewater Authority. So Poughkeepsie's water treatment facility has both carbon and UV technology, right? So
yeah, and it has something like an oxidation stage that's unique as well.
Right. So, I mean, the drinking water coming from the Hudson for Poughkeepsie is, you know, about as good as it gets, wouldn't you say, for municipal drinking water?
treatment plant there is very impressive. And, it's worth taking a tour if you're going. It's also got a great history. It was back in the Civil War. It was, I think, right before the Civil War broke out, they were going to install the first treatment, filter, the first filtration in the country for drinking water supply, because people were getting cholera. I mean, it was in response to a public health problem. Then the war broke out, and they had to sort of pause because they couldn't get the money and they couldn't do the work. And then the war stopped, and and it was the first in the country. And there's a plaque up, and there's some cool water history in our region.
Right, and I think that what the public doesn't know is that all the drinking water facilities are pretty open and interested in having people visit. So it's always a good idea to do that, to get to know where your drinking water comes from. And so circling back, we're here today because in this article that pointed to our study, to your study, Riverkeeper study with Columbia University, 2 high levels of pharmaceuticals being detected at the outfall in the Rondout Creek. So what happened?
So one important thing just to understand is that when we are doing our monitoring of the Hudson River, we monitor a number of types of sites. So we monitor in the middle of the river at a number of sites. We monitor on the edge of the river, the shoreline in a number of sites, in some of the tributaries, those smaller creeks and rivers that flow into the river, and then at a number of the sewage treatment discharge points where the treated wastewater flows into the river. But what's unique about the point of our sample in Kingston is that we are often able to sample right at the pipe there, which we can't do in all cases. So the sample that we are able to take at Kingston is really undiluted, treated wastewater. So it's what comes out of the plant, but not mixed at all with other Hudson River or creek water. So so the reason that I mentioned that, and it's important, I think, for that finding about or the spotlight on Kingston as a source of pharmaceuticals is to me, that finding doesn't mean Kingston's got a particular problem with pharmaceuticals. It means wastewater treatment plants are the source of these pharmaceuticals to our water, and we can really measure that really cleanly at the Kingston plant because of the type of sample we can get there. So it's really telling us that if we were, I bet, measure that same undiluted stream of treated water from other treatment plants, we would find similar results. So that's just important to remember if you're sitting there in Kingston, like, oh my God, we're the pharmaceutical capital of the Hudson River. It's like, no, you're just you're a community of people who use pharmaceuticals.
I mean, I can't help but ask this question. So why would Columbia, who is part of the study, point that out so clearly in the article without giving that context? Because the assumption that it came out of the Rondout Creek by the outfall, not before it hits the river where there's dilution, right? So what do you think happened there? Because that's an important distinction.
Well, it's a true statement what's written there. The highest levels are found at the treatment plant outfalls of small communities where we were able to measure. If you get down to the treatment plant outfalls around New York City, there's a tremendous volume of water from the ocean that has a flushing effect on everything. So, it's not saying that there is, those levels could be affecting aquatic life at the point of those outfalls. And there's a lot of outfalls on the river. 350 million gallons per day of treated wastewater is discharged into the Hudson River or its tributaries. I think if I remember, about 10 million gallons of that is from Kingston, so a small fraction. So you add up all of those points of discharge for all those communities up and down the river, and it's an important finding that was stated in that article.
So what is it that so some of these things are discharged from our bodies. We're the waste that's moving out from our homes into the sewer plants to be processed might be coming through our diets and through things that we're eating. Some of it might be, drugs that are flushed or that are poured down the sink. So do we have any sense, if there are any studies to know, why do we have a high level of pharmaceutical drugs coming out of the outfall or coming out of our plant? And the reason I ask is because I'm wondering, I'd like to raise awareness to know what the public can do to help to curb that, if possible. Like, that's the first step. What can we do to improve the numbers there?
Well, so we advocated for, so the sources are what we excrete from our own bodies from taking pharmaceuticals. So the only way to reduce that is to not get sick or not use pharmaceuticals, to treat whatever ails you. That's a personal choice and one to make with your doctor, and question whether you need what's out there. I can't advise on that. After that, the other sources are flushing of unused medications, and that was recommended for a number of years from different sources because use of unused medications for abuse is an important problem, and it's particularly with the opioid epidemic that we've got, and it's particularly affected Ulster County. It's a huge problem to think if somebody's prescribed pills for pain relief and then doesn't use them all, someone else gets those pills and abuses them and becomes addicted. That was a pathway that ruined a lot of people's lives and killed a lot of people, and still is affecting a lot of people. So that was one of the reasons that this recommendation is out there, to flush medications as a way to prevent the reuse and abuse of them. So the alternative to that are there are drop boxes. There's some there, and I think I shared with you a page that's just labeled Pharmaceuticals on Riverkeeper's site, and it has the links that I haven't updated in a while. I hope they're still working, but that go community by community, and you can find out where those drop boxes are located. So they're typically at police stations or the clerk's office sometimes of municipalities, and you can go and drop your medications there. And they're secure, and then they're incinerated someplace, taken care of without discharging them to water. We also lobbied for the Drug Take Back Act in 2018, and actually this study we were talking about, the EPA did, was cited by the state in their study of what to do and why to do it about pharmaceuticals leading up to that act's passage. So another thing you can do is, I'm a little hesitant to say this because of the moment we're in with the pandemic, but we can ask our Department of Health at the state level to implement that law, because it's passed and it's going through the process of being implemented, but it's not yet implemented. When it is finally implemented, it will require those drop boxes and other easy ways to get rid of unused medications, not just at the police department, but also at pharmacies. So just about every CVS and Rite Aid where you pick up your prescription will have a place that you can easily dispose of the unused, the same medications that you haven't used if you didn't use your whole prescription. That's what that act really will do. And it's a great frustration to Ulster County Department of Health, among others, that hasn't been implemented because of the risk that ongoing risk of abuse of opioids that is not being addressed through providing that convenient way to get rid of pharmaceuticals.
Dan, at the beginning of our conversation, you were saying that the report led to 2 recommendations, the Columbia Riverkeeper report, that have since been accomplished. What are those?
Yeah, and again, I'm sorry to harp on this, but it was an EPA study that we supported and Columbia supported, and Columbia wrote about it. So it wasn't Columbia supported it, but it was really EPA study. Yeah, so when we put out the results at Riverkeeper, we promoted, broadcast the results, and we were advocating at that time to pass the Drug Take Back Act, which did pass the legislature shortly after. And we said that we need a coalition of municipalities who drink water from the Hudson to work together, and that has also come to pass. So we had to, use the results of the study to advocate for two solution-oriented actions.
That's great. And, what I wouldn't mind just touching upon now are two things. And Jenny, maybe you have something to add too. Talking about the CSO, the Hasbrook CSO in the Rondout Creek, we've had some residents witness during a really heavy rain event, the amount of water that was going into the Rondout Creek to be very high. And it was probably a mix of stormwater and sewer because of how, as we described, how a CSO works. And so a question that's been kind of going around is, how's the water, for the Rondout Creek before and after a strong rain or enough of a rainstorm to cause the stormwater to overflow or overwhelm the sewer pipes. So can you talk a little bit about that while we're focused on the Hasbrook CSO this evening?
Sure. Yeah, and so all the places that we sample, 74 locations in the Hudson River Estuary, and Rondout Creek there is part of the Hudson River Estuary. It's tidal, ebbs and flows with the tides from the Atlantic. The fish from the ocean come and spawn there. It's, this magical habitat, as well as this, beautiful place, and the shipbuildings there, and the boating and kayaking, and, all the things we love about that little stretch of water. So all those locations that we test, mostly what we're testing for is a bacteria that indicates fecal contamination. So that's sewage, or it also could be waste from other warm-blooded animals, birds, dogs, and whatnot. And we've seen, and we compare that data to EPA guidelines for safe swimming. So if you have a high concentration of that bacteria, it means there's a higher likelihood that there are pathogens that can make us sick if we're swimming, if we get that water in our mouth or become fully immersed in it and get it in our eyes, our ears. That's where the risk comes from having sewage in the water, is if you're out there swimming or having other jet skiing, things that are going to have a lot of spray of water in your face, or where you're going to dunk yourself and get immersed. So we compare each site to the EPA criteria. The Rondout Creek doesn't pass. The Rondout Creek, we don't see water quality that meets safe swimming guidelines. The average concentrations tend to be too high, and there are spikes where the concentration is quite high after rain. And so both of those reasons we would exceed the EPA criteria for safe swimming if we were using those criteria here. If we were managing the Rondout as a beach, it wouldn't be open. It would be beach closed much of the time because of that. Now, why is that? The Hasbrook CSO certainly is part of that. It overflows, and I've watched it myself. A heavy thunderstorm comes in, and a flush of water will run through the pipes, and then you can wait a beat, and poof, you watch that kind of muddy discharge emanate from that pipe. So that's certainly one source. But you've got a lot upstream too. You have to remember, upstream of Kingston is the whole Rondout Creek. Through a number of communities with their own wastewater treatment plants and their own septic systems. You've got the entire Wallkill River, which meets the Rondout, and they form, they're two big arms of one river system, and they come together just upstream of Kingston. And the Wallkill River has more sewage discharges to it from treatment plants than any other tributary on the Hudson River, other than the Mohawk River and the
How
Upper
large is the
Hudson.
Wallkill, Dan? And it spans 2 states, right?
I heard how large is it? What was the second part of your question?
That it spans 2 states.
Yeah, it's about 80 or 88 miles, I think is the length. It flows out of New Jersey, northern New Jersey, and then up through Orange County and Ulster County, and then meets the Rondout. And it's actually a larger, it's a longer river. It's got a bigger watershed. It has a higher volume of water than the Rondout Creek when they join, but we call it the Rondout Creek. So we think the Rondout Creek is bigger, but the Wallkills is the bigger of the two, as you go upstream and think about where they come together. So on the Wallkill, there's a big regional treatment plant in northern New Jersey. You've got the city of Middletown, villages of Walden and Montgomery and New Paltz, and a number of other communities that have treatment plants. Some of these have very old systems. Walden, for instance, has a pump station that overflows, very frequently, just like the Hasbrook CSO. So there are other points of discharge, and we know there are. So any problems on the lower part of the Rondout Creek past Kingston are partly a function of what happens right there in Kingston and the Sophis and town of Ulster, and also what's coming in from upstream.
Jenny, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, I was just wondering, considering how much is coming from the metro region and New Jersey, because the Wallkill flows north from some very heavily populated areas, does Riverkeeper sample before the Wallkill meets the Rondout for those quantities?
Yeah, we work with volunteers to sample the whole Wallkill from its source, Lake Sparta in New Jersey, as well as the whole Rondout downstream of the reservoir. New York City has one of its reservoirs in the upper part of the Rondout, and we sample downstream of that. So it's about, I think it's 30 or 40 miles of the Rondout, I forget offhand, and all 88 of the Wallkill, more or less. So we see that, I guess, two truisms, of the Wallkills. I mean, traditionally, there was, before we started sampling, I would often hear, if you were in Orange County, you'd say like, well, it's coming from New Jersey, so yeah, it's not our problem. And if you're in Ulster County, you'd say, it's coming from Orange County, it's not our problem. And what we found is like, conveniently, like the border samples, that the New Jersey, New York line is not great by any stretch, but it gets worse through Orange, part of Orange County after coming out of New Jersey. And similarly, it has improved somewhat by the time it gets to the border between Orange County and Ulster, and then sees another decline in water quality as it goes through parts of Ulster. So everybody's got a role in the solutions to the Wallkill, and the good thing is there's a great group, the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance, is working closely with a lot of the municipalities in the river, as well as the agencies that work with farmers, because farm runoff is also a big concern for the Wallkill, and working towards solutions there. It'll be, it's not going to happen overnight, but things are happening to really take a lot of action on the Wallkill.
So Kingston, yeah.
I have one more question, which was about the fact that the Hudson River, because it's tidal, I was sort of wondering if the movement of water up and down, sorry, my family's in the kitchen over there. If the movement of the water up and down facilitates less or more exchange as a result of this tidal nature of the river, back and forth, if that helps or hinders the movement of pharmaceuticals out of the estuary?
Well, so we've been focused on the one study that looked at that the EPA did. We haven't really talked about the second study that we worked with Cornell University on, and or wait, maybe it was in that one. Let me just find this finding. I think it was the EPA study. It did find that for, we were talking about maybe before we flipped the switch and everyone could hear about sucralose and caffeine, which are part of both of these studies, not because they're particularly harmful or a concern, but because they are good tracers of wastewater. Sucralose is an artificial sweetener. It's a 0-calorie sweetener because we can taste it on our tongues, but we don't metabolize it. So it doesn't, we don't gain any weight from it. We don't take any calories in, and we we excrete it, and it enters the environment. And similarly, like not much out there can metabolize it. So once it's out there, it's sort of out there. So we can look at those kinds of tracers to understand the cumulative impact of some of this. And one of the findings, I wish I could remember which one it was, which study, showed that there's a cumulative impact down the river. So if you measure the water at the middle of the river at Yonkers, you see a lot more wastewater has entered the river, and there are trace pharmaceuticals along with that. Then in the upper Hudson, before you start to get to the Capital District or the contributions of some of these tributaries that have a lot of wastewater discharges. Now, different pharmaceuticals have a longer or shorter life, as with every kind of chemical. So, we're very worried about things like PCBs, PFOA, because they don't break down and they just last forever and they remain toxic if we're exposed to them. A lot of other things do break down, and sometimes that's a good thing. They more or less disappear. They turn into something inert. Sometimes they break down into things that can also be harmful in different ways, and there's a lot unknown about that. But the point is, there's a lot of wastewater. We can see that there's a lot of wastewater impact. That doesn't mean that that there's a high concentration of pharmaceuticals associated with that necessarily, but those compounds that are longer lived will build up as the river flows. So the flushing back and forth, to get to the heart of your question, there's ultimately a downstream progression of water, even though we have the back and forth slosh from the tide. So there's still that ultimate downstream flow that is ultimately dominant, right? The water ends up in the ocean.
Yeah, so luckily New Yorkers drink beautiful reservoir water, so they're lucky.
Well, but I think that the truth is that our, even though the New York City watershed, which is Kingston's watershed too, with Cooper Lake, if there's a number of chemicals that we're not, testing or removing from drinking water, then we're all sort of in the same boat. We don't really know, what it is at the end of the day we're taking into our bodies, whether it's from a clean reservoir like New York City has, or City of Kingston has, or it's through the Hudson River or what have you, or through a well. It seems complicated. I guess two things, because we're coming up to the hour. Two things is, one is for community members who are wanting to understand the quality of water to use, to swim or to fish, etc., any sort of recreational use of the Rondout Creek or the City of Kingston. I guess the thing to really to do, what do we do to find out? I suppose in a rainstorm it's best to stay away from swimming or using the river certainly after a rainfall, but I wouldn't want to give that advice. Maybe you have some good advice for the community to understand what to do. There's been a lot of dialogue on.
I'll send you another link that you might share with the report ultimately. But so we, as I said, compare all the data to EPA guidelines for safe swimming, and those are set at thresholds in order to prevent more than about 3% of people getting sick who go in the water. Now that doesn't mean dying. It means it might be if you have an open cut on your leg, it might get infected. It's not something you want to have happen, but it just the range of types of getting illness can range from minor to significant. And if we're measuring bacteria that indicates we're over that line, it doesn't mean suddenly we've gone from 0 risk to 100% risk. It's a gradual increase. So the data we put out, we want people to understand it enough to be able to see there's more risk here, there's less risk here. We see, for instance, that away from the shorelines in the Hudson River, except in the Capital District where we have all those overflows, the water quality is often good, even after rain. The shorelines are often good, except right after rain. The tributaries are often risky after rain, or in some cases, higher risk all of the time. Now that doesn't mean to me that I stay away from them and I don't enjoy that water. It means I know there is a risk and I act accordingly. The way I act accordingly is, number one, I advocate to clean up the water so there's less risk or no risk. And then number two, if you are swimming someplace that is not pristine, then you act accordingly. Maybe you're not going to dive and swim, but maybe you're going to kayak, which is a much less risk. If I, as a relatively healthy person, that's how I feel. But I've talked with people who have a compromised immune system, and they've said to me, thank you for putting this data out there. I'm only going to go to the most pristine spots because I can't risk any kind of infection. I'm getting treated for cancer or whatever it might be. So each individual has a different risk tolerance, and it's important to understand that and make an informed choice. I try to make the analogy with Lyme disease. When I was first growing up in the Hudson Valley, either we didn't have Lyme disease or we didn't know it was out there. I spent all my time in the woods and I loved it. Then, as a young adult, I learned about Lyme disease. I understood that there's a risk from going in the woods. You might get a tick. It might be carrying this illness. I didn't stop going in the woods because I love it. But I know there's a risk. I manage it and I take care to enjoy what I love, understanding there's some risk associated with it. So that's how I hope people use our data, is to understand we need to advocate for cleaner water, and where there is some risk, we need to understand it enough that we can choose wisely where and when we get in the water, and enjoy it with an understanding of the risks that are there.
And the city of Kingston has done a lot to work on this problem, as you were pointing out. And I think it would be nice to end on that note to talk about what has the city of Kingston done to improve the outfall, the overflow, the CSO in the Rondout Creek, and what is a helpful thing that the public can do to support the city in its work to improve the problem that's been there for 100 years. What would you suggest that they do? So let's start with Kingston's advancements in dealing with the problem.
Yeah, so I think just in the last 6 months or so, I guess about 6 months ago, the state put out its latest round of grants. And I think it was about almost $3 million that the city got to do close to $7 million of total project work to separate sewers in the Hasbrook watershed and other work. So that's big, it's big money.
Where did the money
that's
come
the
from?
kind
What pot of money was that, Dan, from the state?
The Clean Water Infrastructure Act is the biggest source, and it's usually paired with federal money from the Clean Water Revolving Fund, which is the biggest way that the federal government supports these projects. Over decades, the share that the federal government has contributed has, as with all things Mitch McConnell touches and his lot, it's less and less and less contributed to public goods like this. So more and more burden has fallen to the local and the state governments to maintain and upgrade this infrastructure over time. And the states stepped up in the last several years to invest quite a bit and help cities like Kingston do this work.
And Jenny, did you have something?
Oh, I was just going to say a lot of thanks to your efforts, tireless efforts to advocate for that Infrastructure Act. So thank you.
Yeah, we did. I mean, there were a lot of people who did. What?
Mm-hmm. I said Riverkeeper did a lot to help to make sure there was $2.5 billion over the course of 5 years.
Also, it's true that Kingston has done study upon study and a lot of engineering analysis to get ready for this, and it was ahead of the curve when it came to going for these grants. So
what can the public do today, Dan and Jenny? I mean, for just some closing thoughts and useful tips for the community. One is, please don't flush your pharmaceutical drugs down the toilet or dump down the drain. That we'll provide some links, the Riverkeeper links, that helps to locate locations that are available where they'll take your drugs for your additional drugs that you're not using for free. You mentioned that there's a new law that needs to be implemented, and that in Ulster County there's frustration that hasn't happened. Is there something that you talked about the Department of Health? I mean, can community members advocate in that way too? I mean, we can go into more information.
Yeah.
But would that be useful?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we don't have, there's nothing published out there. There's not like an action alert that people can click on to make it really easy to do that. But I would say if it's important to you, the best way to influence the State Department of Health is probably through your state assembly person or state senator, or both, really. So call them up, say, the Drug Take Back Act was really important. It's important for public health. It's important to stop water pollution. What's going on? Talk to the Department of Health, get them to implement this law. Let's we understand there's a pandemic and that's paramount. It's very important and they're working hard on it, but let's make sure we keep going on these other important issues as well. And then the third thing I would say is, at the local level, as I said, these projects to improve the sewers cost a lot of money. So when they come up for votes, support the politicians who are advocating for them, back them up. Often we see that, elected officials want to do the right thing, but they need the public to express that support so they can say to those who don't want to see that money spent, hey, look, people want this. This is important to our constituents. So be that constituent that lets them know it's important. It's always good. So I don't know. I haven't studied. I don't know if there's anything coming up that'll be on an agenda anytime soon. But just to remain alert for that and to speak up. So in every case, basically, speak up. Talk to your elected official. Tell them what's important to you. That's the key to life.
That's wonderful, Dan. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us this evening, taking time.
Thanks for having me.
We know how hard you work, and this has been really helpful, and I'm sure that there'll be a lot of interest in it. So thank you, Dan.
Well, thanks for having me. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good night. Another great night, Jenny. I'm so glad we're doing this. It's so wonderful to talk to the people we're talking to, and Dan Shapley is, getting a chance to work with him every day is pretty amazing. But I mean, you can hear the amount of information that he has and that we're working with it's a lot.
Yeah.
So hopefully tonight we were able to help Kingston community understand better the pharmaceutical comments that had to do with the Kingston Rondout Creek, and learn more about the combined sewer overflow system that we have, CSOs, and the city's work to improve them. And we'll share the How's the Water, which is Riverkeeper's really good science handouts. They're very simple. People can keep them. And hopefully it'll be a good tool going forward. And next week, we're going to start talking about the City of Kingston's comprehensive plan zoning process, which we're in the midst of. The city has gotten to the point where, and I was serving on that committee for a moment, but gotten to the point where they have put together an RFP, a request for proposal, has sent that out. They have secured what seems like a consultant to do something called form-based code for the city. So I don't know, I don't want to give it all away, but maybe you can give us an overview, because this is one of your wheelhouses and what we have to look forward to next week.
So form-based code is really different from the traditional zoning. And it's great that Kingston is taking this on, because it's especially important for communities where there's the shape of the community is so wrapped up in the streetscape and the way that, especially in a dense community like Kingston, especially in communities where there may need to be new construction that is in keeping with that streetscape. Form-based code, instead of telling you what you cannot do and where you cannot build, like traditional zoning, it tells you the shape of the envelope that you can build, that you can use to build. And it creates a streetscape that's more, not only is it more, it can be predictable, but also creative. And it can also allow, it depends on the quality of the actual form-based code that's put into place, but it helps every developer, whether it's a single house builder or someone who's developing a large row of buildings, to understand what they are allowed to do and in what shape. So the result is generally much more compatible with communities like Kingston that have a need to replace what has started to devolve. For example, gas stations and empty lots along Broadway, or buildings that seem incompatible with the historic fabric. It allows for that it allows for new construction to improve and connect better with that landscape.
You know, one of the unfortunate things about the zoning process now is that when the city embarked upon its new comprehensive plan in 2014, 13, before it became adopted in 2016, there was a bond for $99,000 to do a comp plan and zoning. And so it sort of sets us up to have this expectation that doing this is cheap. And you know, there's been a lot of questions about why zoning costs a lot of money, why the process costs so much. The comp plan was only $100,000, or the comp plan with zoning was only $100,000. And I think that that's one of those things that I wish the city could have done a better job at explaining, but of course that's a complicated conversation to have, because that was a decision that the city made.
I think we can get into the history of that when we talk with Tanya.
Yeah,
I
let's
do
do
have a
that.
lot of background in that story, and we can get into that next week. So
Great.
cliffhanger, everyone.
Yeah, let's hold on to that. That's great. And I think that would be helpful too for the public to understand because it is expensive, but
It
it's
is expensive, and in
really
fact,
important.
form-based code costs more than regular zoning because regular zoning is much more of a prescriptive and rule-oriented. Form-based code requires a lot of architectural design and in that interaction with community members and stakeholders and various neighborhoods to really understand how they envision the future of their own streetscapes and their city. So, but it's actually easier to administer, and it's also easier for developers to utilize. So on the back end, it'll end up being, or downstream, I should say, it'll end up being a less expensive process. So it's more expensive up front.
Yeah,
Also, I just want to say a word about Tanya, because without someone like Tanya, we wouldn't have the kind of deep involvement in this particular topic that she brings. She's a citizen activist who has made it her business to learn so much about new urbanism and form-based code and everything that we do related to design matters in Kingston. So we're really privileged to have citizens who are that engaged. And if there are other citizens who are that engaged, who are interested in talking with us about their topics, I think that would be a great idea for us to invite them on the show.
I do too. I wish we had more time. I mean, and who knows, maybe, in time we will. I mean, it's always, I'm glad we even get this on, we've gotten this off the ground. I think this is important and it's a lot of work. And so, however, yeah, if you're interested in joining us in asking questions and even, recommending topics, please contact us at Rebecca with 1 B and 2 C's at kingstoncitizens.org. Or Jenny, do you want to give your work address? Do you have an email?
Well, it's, you can send it to J Berky at honestrategic.com.
Or strategic.com or .com.
Honestrategic.com. You'll find my email there, or you can send it to J Berky at honestrategic.com.
Jenny, thanks so much. I look forward to next week's conversation, and I appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a great show.
All right. See you soon.
Take care.